The gloves seem to be coming off after 3 years and considerable attrition of Ukraine's finest and bravest soldiers. Why has it taken so long? And has the West left it too late to wake up to the threat of Russia? Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and check you are subscribed to the channel so you don't miss out on the fantastic speakers that we feature. Please also thank you to everybody who has bought me a coffee or become a patron. It's incredibly important to help the work of the channel continue and even grow. And also a huge thank you to those who've been helping us to reach the target for the documentary film. A link will be provided in the description. It's fantastic what you're doing, helping us to send a documentary crew to create some amazing footage to challenge Russian propaganda in film festivals. So we are extremely grateful to everyone who've helped us reach our first target on that. Today I'm joined by Jon Sweet and Mark Toth. Jon Sweet is an accomplished intelligence professional who served for 30 years within the defense and intelligence sector as a US Army intelligence officer. He is now a freelance author, contributor, and columnist for The Hill, The Messenger, Washington Examiner, Kyiv Post, and Fox News. He provides an experienced military perspective on current world events. Mark Toth is a retired economist, historian, and entrepreneur and has lived in US diplomatic and military communities around the world. Mark writes on issues of national security and foreign policy and is a regular contributor to The Hill, BBC, Washington Examiner, Fox News, Kyiv Post, and The Messenger as well. So I'm delighted to be joined once again by Mark and Jon. I know the audience found our previous conversations to be thrilling and extremely important and useful, and I know that many people will have become aware of the prodigious and incredibly important output of Jon and Mark in publications like The Hill and many others as well. As usual, we'll put links to those in the description of the video, but I know many people watching this will have been tuned into those materials and will start to appreciate how important those the debates and analysis are. Let's start with Russia's nuclear saber rattling. It seems that the long-range strike approvals in Kursk for ATACMS, as well as Storm Shadow, Scalp, etc., it seems to have really rattled the Kremlin, and they've been doing their nuclear threat thing with probably more intensity than we've seen for quite a time. How seriously do you take those nuclear threats, or is it simply trying to deter the West from taking a bold stance against Russian aggression?
I'll start off and then I'll let Mark chime in. I believe the threats are just that they're more threats. It's more saber rattling, at least in my opinion. The Russian military doesn't like it when you push back, and Ukraine is in a position obviously to push back with precision deep strike authorities that have been granted, one by Biden with the use of ATACMS, but also have been granted also by the United Kingdom and France, which have both stepped up with the Storm Shadow missile and the Scout missile, authorizing those strikes to occur too. The one limiting factor, obviously, to the release of those authorities is that those authorities are restricted just to the Kursk Oblast and the Russian North Korean forces that are presenting that threat to a counteroffensive. So yeah, it's what Putin's done since the onset of the war, which is to threaten a nuclear type of response, escalation, in order to deter certain types of activity from the West. We've seen this now for the better part of 33 months, and I suspect we're going to see it again. The use, though, of the most recent use of the hypersonic missile that was introduced earlier in the week is just more showcasing of a capability that he wants the West to understand that he has, that he may attach a nuclear warhead to. But I'm not confident that he's willing to use nuclear weapons over Ukraine. He may, as Gerasimov pointed out to General Milley early in the war, in other circumstances in which the regime is threatened, in which nuclear weapons are used, in which there's a catastrophic battle loss. Those are the three criteria that were established early. And those are the three criteria I think that the Biden administration in the West has been most concerned about. So, Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd add a couple points to that. I think one, as John and I've written in the past, Putin tends to view his nuclear arsenal as a teddy bear. When he needs to mollify the Russian public, he pulls it out. When there's some kind of reversal on the battlefield, he pulls it out. I would say it's a little bit different this time, but not ominous. It's really about messaging. I mean, you have to look at that the change in doctrine that Putin announced a week ago, roughly from the time of this taping, that change in doctrine really is about messaging to the incoming Trump administration. It's a reaction to Biden's action of authorizing the use of attacks inside of Russia. And Putin feels like he's got to draw some kind of red line. Now, in John and mine's opinion, we've written extensively on this. That's an imaginary red line. It's one that the West has crossed repeatedly and has never resulted in the use of nuclear weapons. So I really don't think that's what's going on. In a similar parallel vein, you also saw with just the recent meeting with Xi Jinping and Biden, where Xi was trying to set those same kind of early red lines that really didn't have as much to do about his bilateral relations with Biden, but what he was trying to articulate in the messages he wanted carried back to Trump. So there's a lot of bit of kabuki theater going on here, nuclear kabuki theater, but I'm not as concerned about it either. I think this is something that the Russians pull out when they need to. John is right. The use of those they weren't intercontinental, as some people argue. They were intermediate range ballistic missiles. That was simply to display a technology. But in doing that, he kind of also, let the cat out of the bag that he used the only two that apparently are operational, at least at this point. So, it's a deterrence until it's not, and right now it's not. And it certainly doesn't negate the US or Western nuclear arsenals themselves. So a lot of showsmanship, but I don't see this devolving quickly into some kind of nuclear confrontation.
And Putin seems to have been at pains to retain what you could call the escalation dominance throughout the war. And many Western powers, NATO, Washington, Berlin, seem to have been at pains to retain what the opposite of dominance is. Escalation subservience maybe is a sort of a concept we could use here. And it very much embodied, of course, Jake Sullivan's been a figure of someone through escalation management, has very much embodied that kind of strategy. At this point, do we see the West starting to get beyond that mindset to think, to actually convince Putin that he cannot win this war, we're going to have to stop worrying about triggering Moscow, triggering Putin, worrying about these sort of responses he might give. Are we starting to see the signs that we're not pulling our punches anymore in dealing with Moscow?
Yeah, I think we're starting to see that particularly. Look, 33 months into the war, and I think the Biden administration is starting to realize that constantly taking a step back and threats of escalation has only led to more escalation. And I think the response that you're seeing from Great Britain and France, particularly with the use of their precision deep strike weapons, is following the lead of the United States. So I do believe there comes a point where the West has to understand that letting Putin have the initiative, ceding the initiative to Putin, allowing him to take everyone up the escalation ladder and to follow him is probably not the best course of action. And to come to a manner which that they can bring the war to some sort of conclusion is not going to be reacting to an escalation and compromising with Putin, because I think we all understand that Putin's words and signatures on treaties and peacekeeping deals are for the most part meaningless. And I think we've come to that point that we understand that, and we look at his reactions to how Ukraine reacts, and it's typically targeting civilians, it's typically going after energy infrastructure. And I believe the West is probably getting around to the point where everything we do has that reaction. And the more we continue to follow the escalation ladder, the more Ukrainian lives are lost and the more Ukrainian territory is lost. So, Mark?
Yeah, Jonathan, I'd argue that the escalation that we're seeing right now coming from the West, you got to take it into context again of this transition period. John and I have argued really, I know you called it subservience, whatever. We've called it paralysis. I truly think that the West doesn't completely understand how Russia's going to react. It may be an information gap. It may be not knowing how to game plan this out. They just don't know, and it's paralyzed them. Now we think, and we've argued for all the wrong reasons, and we've laid that blame solely and squarely on Jake Sullivan in doing that. But that's one thing. But in terms of the initiative that Biden has just shown, way too late. Right decision, but way too late. And again, with the caveats, as John and I wrote just I don't know, a few days back, once again in the Kyiv Post, right, John? I think we were writing this.
Yeah.
Once again, attacks are authorized, but here's a huge list of what you can do, what you can't do, et cetera. So what I think is that Biden is being quote unquote a little bit brave, as are potential, the French and the English, but they're doing that within this transition period, believing that the calculus is Putin isn't going to do anything major during this transition period. He's going to wait and see what Trump's reaction is to that. And so I'm not so sure that we're past escalation paralysis yet in the US. I think this is a convenient timing of Biden and Macron, as well as Carmer, doing these things. But I think they're doing it under the protective umbrella, and not to praise Trump. I don't mean it in that sense, but they're doing it under the protective umbrella that Trump's somehow going to, temper Putin from letting it get out of control, at least at this point. So I'm not as encouraged by it. And, I'd end on the point, even someone like retired General Barry McCaffrey was saying this is too little too late. Sounds good, seems good, but this was the wrong messaging at the wrong time. Should have been happening a lot earlier. And John, to a better ability than me, can explain just what that huge cost has been on the battlefield by not greenlighting these sooner.
It is the release of the ATACMS authorities and those other precision munition authorities really only affects the close fight. And Mark and I have been arguing for the better part of 2 years that the close fight's only part of the fight. It's the interdiction aspect. It's stopping the Russian forces, the North Korean forces, and their equipment from getting to the battlefield in the first place. We've argued, and we continue to argue, that Ukraine's been very efficient in killing Russians and blowing up tanks and APCs and artillery. There's upwards of 730,000 Russian casualties right now. There's no issue in a close fight. Ukraine is excelling in a close fight. But when the Russian forces, with embedded, North Koreans and other nationalities that they recruit from, can put 2,000 more in the fight the very next day, and then the next day, and then the next day, it's unrelenting. And the only way to stop that is through interdiction. And the argument that we present is those weapon systems should be going after rail hubs, seaports, airfields, where those troops and their equipment enter the theater before they arrive on the Ukrainian battlefields, and they have to be taken on in the close fight. You have to create space on the battlefield. And if you can't create space by stopping the attack that's going to occur a week from now, the soldiers that are fighting so gallantly and bravely in those trenches, it's every day, and it never ends. You have to give them some maneuver room and breathing space. And that's really part of our argument. Of course, the other part of the argument is, if you can't affect the weapon systems that are launching ballistic missiles into your country and destroying your cities, killing your civilians, right, and knocking out your energy infrastructure, you're constantly behind. Shooting missiles out of the sky is one thing. Destroying a weapon system that delivers it stops the missile. So that's my 2 cents.
There's a psychological point here as well, in addition to the battlefield side of it. There's a poll out just today in Ukraine about who would win a presidential election in Ukraine. And currently it's Zelensky, the former defense minister. He's now the ambassador to the UK, your country. He's winning that poll by 42%. Zelensky's only at 22%. And then you got Budanov, the intel chief, comes in at 18%. And so it's telling you that Ukrainians themselves as a population are becoming war weary. They're seeing the losses at the front, this meat grinder approach, this inability to break this dynamic of the close fight that John just detailed by the use of long-range attacks and other deep precision type strike weapons. It's starting to have a cumulative effect. And so I just want to put an exclamation on that, is that there's the battlefield side, which John rightly just went through, that's causing issues by this delay. But there's also the psychological one. It's Ukraine feeling like we don't know how to get out of this purgatory that we find ourselves in. We don't know that Trump's going to deliver on that or not, but we certainly know that Biden has not, and that we've been stuck in this mold. And so I think that's why I find it kind of interesting that so far in Ukraine, whether rightly or wrongly, There may be a lot of false hope there. There seems in some circles to be relief that Trump has won, that there's some kind of light coming at the end of the tunnel. Time will tell if that's a mirage or real.
And it's been expressed in the way of either, bleed out slowly or be thrown under the bus, slowly by Biden. At least under Trump, it's like ripping the plaster off. You know where you are. You can plan accordingly. There are some interesting nuances underlying that poll you mentioned there with Zaluzhny as well, aren't there? Because Ukraine is perhaps a society that has the most open debates in the public arena at time of war, the most open reporting perhaps of any society facing such a full-scale war. I remind people that in no way in Britain under the Nazi bombs could you express yourself perhaps as freely and without hindrance as Ukrainian journalists. There was very tight censorship here in the Second World War, and certain big stories never made it into popular consciousness because they were repressed due to issues of morale. But underlining it, it's not just perhaps a weariness of Zaluzhny or an incomprehension about what his plan is to win this. There's also an understanding that perhaps his administration has not dealt with some of the remaining pockets of Soviet mindset within the Ukrainian army. And I think Ukrainians will share these stories, personal stories, which talk to some systemic problems and the failure to address them. How important is it that these systemic problems are addressed in the here and now by the incumbent administration in Ukraine?
No, I think that's a great question. Um, uh, Clearly, the war that's being fought right now, the close fight in the all what we call the multi-domain warfare that we saw about a year ago that's diminished somewhat with Ukraine. But we see two different ways of fighting. We're seeing the Ukraine way, which has been to their success, it's been effective. They've been able to inflict large amounts of casualties. They've been able to strike deep targets with organic weapon systems and Neptune and other systems that they developed on their own. But at the same time, they're also being trained and influenced by NATO weapons and also by NATO tactics that are being taught to them. Which earlier in the initial counteroffensives, if you recall, they said were not effective. And they weren't effective primarily because there was a piece missing in the doctrine, which is a combined arms doctrine, which means you have ground forces, you have artillery, but you also have this air component that provides deep strikes, close air support, and they were denied that capability to fight. So they've had to resort to the Ukraine way of fighting, which is close in. And in many cases, it's defense, it's mobile defense, it's baiting people into certain areas, surrounding them and capturing them. So I think there may be some angst within the ranks on how we fight and which way we're going to fight. There's probably more angst on where the munitions coming from and when we're going to get them. There's angst obviously over the fact that they have to cede terrain in a mobile defense. And we see this in the Donbass area where more terrain is being ceded to the Russian advantage, not because the Russians are winning, but simply because Ukrainians are losing manpower, have reduced capabilities with ammunition, and they have to cede terrain. So I think all that plays into the confusion, or if you will, what you talked about, some of the uncertainties of what's going on in the overall fight.
Yeah, I'd only quickly add there. I think you can't put a big enough exclamation mark on the fact that Ukraine has not received the adequate kind of weapons, the adequate amount of air defense systems that they can push to the front lines, any kind of air superiority once they're at the edge of the battlefield and beyond over enemy territory. And we could go on in that list. And then you get to the supply shortages, severe supply shortages of artillery, mortar fire, and it's always a reactive supply situation with the West. It's never proactive in terms of getting Ukraine what it is. So I think for those that want to criticize Ukraine for fighting somewhat the Ukrainian way as opposed to the NATO way, what else are they to do if they don't have all the tools and the kit to be able to fight a combined arms warfare type battle? And so again, yeah, certainly there are pockets, certainly there could be some doctrinal issues. Certainly there could be some people that, within the Ukrainian military that are saying, nope, we need to be doing this. But what else can they do? I mean, they're fighting the Russian army. And they're fighting an army that we thought we'd fight differently as the West. Yet they're forced to fight with the toolkit that they have, and that just doesn't allow them to get there yet. So I think it's a little bit sanctimonious on our part, as the West, to be criticizing Ukrainian field commanders for fighting with what they've got. I mean, I'm loath to quote Donald Rumsfeld, but you go to war with the army that you have, right? And at this point, that's the army that they have, and we're the ones that have failed to get them the army that they need.
So, given that the Biden administration seem to be rushing through as much kit as they can, and it may be worth unpacking that as to whether that's actually happening or not, but they certainly seem minded to send stuff prior to January and the new regime taking over. But what's the fundamental, let's say, deep cynical thinking behind it? This is perhaps more of a political question. Do they think that they can send enough for Ukraine to eventually be victorious? Do they think they can send enough for Ukraine to survive the first, say, 6, 9 months of a Trump administration? Or is the imperative now send as much to Ukraine to ensure that it doesn't fall under Biden's watch, does not taint his legacy with a second Afghanistan? Could there be that kind of thinking going on, as cynical as that might seem? Because it seems they're not immune to that level of cynicism. There seems to have been a deal prior to the election, several months prior to the election, to put pressure on the Ukrainians not to do anything dramatic to defend themselves in order to pander to US internal domestic political concerns. We can see that in that the minute the election was done, drones are launched, missiles sent off. It's quite clear that Ukraine has been, asked to put its hands behind its backs and just take the Russian slaps for several months, which, to my mind, is deeply immoral. But I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah, let me start and then let John get to the military side of it. A week or so back, especially when when Jake Sullivan came out and basically, tried to pin the tail on the Ukrainian donkey as to why they weren't winning, that they didn't have enough manpower, et cetera. John and I began seething, and that's what conceived the piece for the for the Kyiv Post that we were writing, that, this is just crazy. It really is like a doctor who doesn't want a patient to die on his watch, so he doesn't have to fill out the paperwork. She doesn't have to, argue that it was her malpractice, whatever, or have her insurance attacked or find herself in a lawsuit. And so what we're seeing here, in my mind, is it's cynicism and it's worse, yes, but it's just a crass desire of the Biden administration to say, look, at least Ukraine survived under our watch. And it's petty. It's not the kind of messaging, in my opinion, that Ukraine needs to be hearing, and it's too little, too late, and it's basically legacy polishing for the Jake Sullivans, for the Lloyd Austins, for Biden himself and the others, Secretary Antony Blinken. They're wanting to take victory laps that somehow survival was such a good thing. Well, survival is not such a good thing if you set them up to die, shortly thereafter. John can get into the military aspects of that better than me.
Yeah, the answer to your question, Jonathan, is yes. And I know you asked 3 questions, but yes, yes, and yes. As Mark said, we talked about this a lot as we were preparing the Kyiv Post article. And the one point that Mark emphasized the most was this just feels like they're giving Ukraine everything they can so it doesn't collapse on their watch. And there's a bit of that. And unfortunately, again, my opinion is the Biden administration has been very good at throwing dollar bills at a problem and hoping it works itself out. Okay, the weapon systems that they're providing in some cases are weapon systems that we phased out of U.S. inventory. In some cases, the weapon systems that, quite frankly, have expired. Or in other cases, they're weapon systems like the AP mines that are defensive in nature only. From my perspective, they continue to provide Ukraine weapon systems that are solely for defensive purposes. And what that does is simply prolongs the war. It doesn't win the war. They're not helping Ukraine win. Okay, what they're helping Ukraine do is survive, and that's good. But surviving isn't good enough. at 33 months, survive. We're out of business of surviving. Now it comes time to winning. How do you stop? Well, you don't stop a war by defending. Okay. And God, I say this over and over and over, but Patton said it best. It is attack, attack, and attack some more. And unfortunately, that mentality just doesn't exist in the Biden administration. The other mentality, obviously, is one of Civil War General Ulysses S. Grant, which was unconditional surrender mentality, relentless pursuit of the enemy until you exhaust them. They don't do that. They sit back and they wait for the enemy to act, and then they react to those type of circumstances. When I say they, I'm not talking about Ukraine. I'm referring to the United States and the policy shifts and changes that occur. It's all based upon an enemy action. So it's action, reaction, counteraction. And unfortunately for Ukraine, the United States is in reaction mode. And then when they do act, they forecast their actions so that the Russians can react to that before Ukraine can actually respond to it to a threat. And that's what's most frustrating is it's just that inaction and that inability to close out the conflict. And look, they're not going to close it out by defeating Russia, by overthrowing Russia, by invading Russia and going to Moscow. They're going to win if they're going to win. They're going to win by causing those casualties that deter Russia from sending more people in. Okay, and that means they have to be able to interdict. They have to be able to defeat Russia's ability to wage war. And part of that across the multi-domain is knocking out their ability to generate funds to buy weapons from North Korea and from Iran. It's also used again to take out those entry points in which that equipment is coming in before it arrives in Ukraine. But simply throwing money at a problem, while that's become the American way, is not going to win this war. It's going to come from an offensive weapon capability that deters Russia from continuing to attack. And until we reach that deterrent point, that point where Putin says, I simply can't do this anymore, it's going to continue, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I'd also add, I think what you're seeing here is a reflection too of having had a commander-in-chief in Biden that has not served in the military. And I think, if you step back and you look at this from a political and from a foreign policy standpoint, it's almost that he's viewed this war at arm's length as a containment policy. I'm going to contain Russia and Ukraine, weaken them, deplete their military resources, isolate them economically, et cetera. And it was just a containment opportunity, but not something that he really ever got behind the idea of Ukraine needing to win. I mean, if you compare, and I've done this for articles that John and I've written. If you compare the speeches that FDR was giving during the war, his famous fireside chats, his addresses to Congress and the like, you see the war constantly at the forefront. It's there. It's what needs to be won. This is what we're trying to do in Europe. This is what we're going to need to be doing in the Indo-Pacific, et cetera. You didn't really see any of that from a domestic standpoint from the Biden administration. I mean, and consider this, in all of the exit polls, as much as people like John and myself and you, Jonathan, too, that view kind of this role through a national security centric standpoint, only 4% of the American people said their vote was based on national security, really far down the line. And you know what? You can blame the American electorate for that. I don't. I blame the commander-in-chief. Had it been a Republican, I'd have blamed them just as much. If only 4% cared about the outcome on a geoglobal basis of this war in Ukraine, it tells me that the messaging out of the White House failed to take the case to the American people consistently, often, and as much as needed to say, this is why it's imperative that we win. And I think it's because they weren't really out to win. They didn't feel like they needed to sell that and to keep the American people behind it. So in my opinion, when the history books get written and people can look at this unemotionally, unattached, I really think those future historians are going to condemn Biden in the approach that he took, because he really set Ukraine up to fail, and Trump may well be the person that allows that to happen. Who knows? The jury's still out on that. He's not president yet. But I just find it mind-boggling that when I look at that 4%, and I was going through that the exit poll data and the like, is that any kind of global topic. The threat that we're facing in the Indo-Pacific just didn't measure up to anything. And again, not to be critical of Harris as a person, but it wasn't reflected in her campaign either. She'd bring it up as a talking point, but then would move on. And she clearly thought, and I get it, that's the calculus of campaigns, clearly thought that wasn't a winning topic. But I think that became a uh, what's the right word? A self-fulfilling kind of situation where because they refused to talk about it, then they couldn't talk about it. And then we have this result of, where Ukraine is in a precarious situation.
And I think we have underestimated how much the media, the broad legacy media, takes its cue from political masters. If they are not talking about a topic, if they're not placing emphasis on a topic, then the media will probably, not take their cue. They will not sort of proactively pick up on that. And I think we've seen some of that take place here as well. The question I wanted to bring up, though, is that the other lever that could be pulled, if you're going in full attack mode, if you're aligning behind Ukrainian victory, then surely the Russian economy is a great place to apply pressure in order to convince Putin that his war is pointless and is going to cost a huge amount to execute. We're now seeing considerable duress in the Russian economy, but it seems from looking at various critical analyses, there are many, many levers of pressure that could have been applied to the Russian economy and especially the war economy that just have not been applied even now, 3 years into this thing. Is that another area of dereliction that you could point not just at Biden, but also at Europe, which has allowed numerous dual-use components to find their way into the Russian war machine?
Yeah, as a former economist, I'll start and let John give his thoughts. You can still buy a Pepsi apparently in Moscow. So that tells you there's a problem, that the sanctions are not as pervasive as they need to be. Now, while I caution, don't get me wrong, the Russian economy is not in a good situation. There's 10% inflation rate, that we know of, that we can get our hands around, but it's much higher at the human cost. Butter up 25%, different kind of food costs up 25%. So I mean, where the pain gets felt the most, it's hurting people. There's an economic bubble that's being created because basically most Russian personal investment is trapped inside of the country. It's competing to buy buildings, farms, whatever, in small industry, and it's causing inflationary prices on all of those. At some point, when investment can go elsewhere, you're going to see that bubble burst. Now, where I'm a little bit less optimistic, though, is that I know a lot has been made that at some point the oligarchs themselves are going to be upset. They're not going to be getting their cuts. But I think people overestimate the position that oligarchs hold in Russia. John and I early on in the war kind of wrote that, look, and I think it was the Hill, John, correct me if I'm wrong. We wrote where how Putin's oligarchs are replaceable. That's why you see them fall out of buildings so much. They're not the power structure, they're the money managers. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that in the West. Whereas the real power, it's the FSB. And it's only when you start to see cracks in that I think you're ultimately going to be able to say, yep, maybe the regime is in trouble. But right now, we're not seeing that yet. The FSB remains in control. And again, I've said this before, I'm not the one that came up with this, but basically Russia is an intelligence service, the FSB, a couple of others that group with that, with a country and a military attached. And with oligarchs that are hired, managed, to take care of Putin's assets and the like. So, and I think if you link that with China, with the fact that China is kind of gone all in on this. The use of dual technologies now are permitted, and they're to have that flow. They're continuing to buy cheap oil and the like. I don't know that collapse of the Russian economy is going to come soon enough. As much as we all want that, and we can all look at the measurements of that. But dictatorial states are pretty damn good about staying in survival, even amidst imploding economies. Nazi Germany being a classic example of that. And John.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to Mark's comments are the United States and NATO at the outset of the war, the onset of the war, probably imposed some of the strictest economic sanctions against a country and the leadership within the country ever before in history. But the enforcement of those sanctions is what's missing. Money corrupts, right? People will bypass sanctions in order to make their money. And in some cases, when it comes to energy, they can look the other way too, because they don't want to stop the flow of liquid natural gas or oil during the winter. They want to ensure that they as a country can prosper. So the lure sometimes of reaching back in to Russia, in the case of Hungary, I think Slovakia, is that there's cheap fuel for them to continue to tap into. So you get a number of countries, I think, in some cases, they're playing both sides of the fence, but you get a lot of business that plays both sides of the fence too, because of the economic, the amount of money that's coming into them. So I think enforcement of sanctions has probably been weakest. And we've put too much emphasis, and we've talked about this before in articles that we've written about national interests or national instruments of power. And one of those, instruments being the economic instrument, and too much emphasis was placed on that early and not enough on the military piece, and finding that balance of dime. And I think we're starting to get to that balance where more is going towards military and diplomacy. We're still losing, I think, in the world of information. But the economics has definitely been a sore spot on all sides.
Yeah, and quickly add, I mean, you can look across the board, whether it's, Hungary's still importing energy from Russia, whether it's the shadow fleet that goes unmolested, it's shipping Russian oil, around the world, coming out of the Baltic, et cetera. I mean, there's just so many areas that we have failed. So, I mean, Jonathan, I think it's a great point that you bring up, is that, these sanctions needed to be tougher, enforced more, and more pervasive. But again, I think it gets to that overall issue of, was this more about containment, or was this really about winning? And sadly, I think now, as the Biden administration comes to an end, it's going to be more about that it was containment. And we see these scandals popping up. Again, in the scheme of things, this is minor, but I happened to see it. I didn't read too much about it. But I think even in the UK, you've got a scandal going on right now where there's a gentleman that admitted that he was bypassing sanctions to sell high-end cologne, to Russia. So if he can get that through, imagine what else is actually getting through that's not coming to light.
Well, until recently, some of the largest corporations in the UK and Europe were still operating in Moscow. As you pointed out, Pepsi, my understanding, still is. Until just a month ago, Unilever was still operating. And technically, its consumer goods were outside of the sanctions regime. But I think, all of this clearly needs to be questioned. Containment is, I would say, quite a painful idea, isn't it? Because clearly escalation management has contained nothing. Rather, by sort of, not taking the appropriate dose of antibiotics or anti-Putinotics or whatever it is, we've only made the adversary stronger, only made the adversary bolder. We've seen last week internet cables apparently severed in a joint Chinese-Russian operation, or that's the suspicion at least. This week, we've seen a DHL plane disastrously crash with some loss of life. That is after a few weeks ago, incendiary devices were placed on planes as a test run by Russia. Now, it's not proven that that's what's brought this plane down, but it was also in the zone of the Baltic jammer, interfering with its avionics and guidance system. So Russia is acting as a kind of, and this is a quote from a well-known Ukrainian journalist, it is this Hezbollah in the snow. It's a terrorist entity which is getting increasingly aggressive in the European sphere. Do you see a sign that we are waking up to tackling this? And what will it take in order for Europe, at the very least, to take this threat seriously?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Mark and I have talked about this before, and Mark has alluded to it earlier in this interview. Where the Russian conventional military fails, the FSB succeeds. The FSB is the action arm of Putin outside of Ukraine. And yes, sabotage is one of those actions that they're very proficient in. And we wrote just before the Olympics this year in Paris, France, how individuals were arrested and accused of setting the conditions for sabotage during the Olympics by knocking out railheads or the rail networks, by starting fires. We've seen how many ammunition facilities in Europe, particularly 155 munitions that would be delivered to Ukraine, catch on fire mysteriously. It was in Germany. We had one in England, I believe. In Poland, we had two in the United States. That DHL plane that went down in Lithuania earlier this week. Mark and I reported this several weeks ago that that there were plans by Russia to do just that, and that they had set conditions and that they had been compromised. So no, the FSB is the action arm. And look, the cables are one thing, but let's look at what else the FSB is doing. Let's look at the Sahel region and the use of mercenaries to overthrow governments like in Mali, in Niger. Look at the coup that occurred in Sudan. Look at the continual bombing that's going on in Syria by Russian assets. Look at the support that Russia is giving to both North Korea and Iran. This is all about creating as many distractions as they can outside of Ukraine, where the conventional military is failing miserably. But nonetheless, Putin is able to mass, and we use this word a lot in some of our writings, but Russia is very good at massing two things: soldiers and artillery. Okay, and that's the way they fight. They like static targets, and they like to assault them frontally with massive amounts of artillery and infantrymen. So again, where the conventional army fails in Ukraine, the FSB has been very successful in disinformation and sabotage attacks throughout the world. Mark, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would only quickly add that I think it's important that Europe understand that it's going to become increasingly the ground zero of Russian sabotage, spying, espionage, etc. I think especially as the Trump administration comes in, at least initially, and until it pans out what he does or doesn't do with respect to Ukraine, I think you'll see a tamping down temporarily of what he's trying to do inside the U.S. Because John and I warned about that as well, that Russia is bringing its war to the U.S. In addition to what he's been doing in Europe. But I think with Trump's election, there's at least going to be a pause, if not some brakes hit. That doesn't mean Putin's going to stop. I think it only means it's going to intensify more inside of Europe. And I think it's important for people to remember this is not something new. I mean, if you go back, and I know the reporting's been hitting in the UK especially, maybe getting missed somewhat here in the United States, as you go back and you realize that these orders to poison and assassinate people throughout Europe, and including the ones, and I can't think of their names right now. Jonathan, you can help me out here. The guys, the two Russian expatriates that were
There's
killed.
Skripal. There was the
Yep,
ex
there you go.
KGB agent Skripal, and
Right,
also Litvinenko, who was the agent, again ex-agent and critic
right.
of the Kremlin, who was poisoned with polonium, I think, if I got that.
Correct. Yeah, I just cannot remember the names, but those are the kind of things that I think Europe's going to have to be on guard on. That there are going to be more of that, because and again, it would be a Russian reaction to the to the American election. But I think Europe is at more at risk, and I think the sooner Europe can get its hands around that and understand that, hey, we're at this ground zero, we need to be prepping and doing more, not less. I think that's going to be an important element to keep a watch on.
So the last question, I think, and this is probably one of the more tricky ones to answer. We don't know what Trump's going to do. We don't know what his policy is going to do. There are plenty of intermediaries like Sebastian Gorka, even Orban, who are making comments about what the policy will be. But of course, we don't know. However, there are plenty of useful idiots and people who are amplifying Russian talking points. We have some who are doing it, I think, very consciously, such as Tucker Carlson. We have those who perhaps just slip into that warm bath of toxic narratives because that's all they're exposed to. People like Joe Rogan, for instance. But it's not just about these sort of toxic voices and the sort of circling of the wagons by people who are, who are immersed in Russian narratives. We see something perhaps more interesting and more concerning taking place. The export of a certain political technology and potentially even state capture taking place with an appointment of someone like Tulsi Gabbard, for instance. This, to my non-Washington standpoint, looks very similar to processes we see in Georgia, where you see this sort of takeover of state institutions, the attempt to take over Moldova, for instance, the current attempt to place a Kremlin puppet in Romania. I think we don't like to think about the US being subject to or even victim of these kind of techniques of political technology and state capture. But to my eyes, that seems to be what is starting to take place. Am I being over dramatic, or do you see those same worrying signs as well?
I think it's a good observation and one that needs to be considered. And I say that in this means, Mark and I have argued in the past that, or at least I have probably more so than Mark, is the process of political appointees in the U.S. government is broken. We put inexperienced people into positions because of their political leanings, not necessarily because of their understanding of the position that they're going to go into. In the OJT, the learning time for those people to get on board to be effective leaders could take anywhere between 12 months to the end of the administration. So that's one failure. The second failure, and it's occurring right now within the Trump administration, is this concept of bypassing an FBI background investigation, which in my mind is criminal. We don't let soldiers, 18, 19, 20-year-old soldiers in the military handle classified information without a background investigation. So why would we ever allow a politician or anyone for that matter, a fundraiser, a bundler, whoever is supporting the president in his election, why would we ever allow them to go into office without the most basic of investigations on them, which would be the FBI investigation? Look, the position of Office of Director of National Intelligence, that is probably one of the more critical positions within this administration, okay? And quite frankly, the Trump appointee, while she may have been, and some people will argue, an officer in the United States Army, okay, she was a lieutenant colonel in the Medical Service Corps. How does that fit the duty description for someone who's going to be managing the intelligence enterprise, not just the CIA, but rather all 17 bureaus within the United States government that touch intelligence? How does she manage that? Her experience as a senator doesn't give that to her either. And yes, there are a lot of questions that are being asked. And, quite frankly, she needs to go before the subcommittee there and testify and answer the questions that people have. So recess appointments and bypassing FBI investigations are not a way to build trust and confidence in your government. And I think right now the Trump administration needs to step back, reconsider their approach to getting their people in. Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, just a little quick housekeeping. She was not a senator, but a House of Representative.
You're right. You're right.
So Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, clearly she doesn't belong anywhere close to, being the DNI, as I tweeted, said, etc. I'd step back. I'm not so sure that it's state capture, Jonathan, that we're seeing here. I think it's more that you've got to kind of step back and look at Trump's worldview, how he manages businesses, how he's governed before. He likes to create chaos, and I think that's one thing. But he's also a vengeful guy. And I think a lot of these appointments that have a lot of us scratching our heads, going, what the heck? Really stronger language, but it's a podcast, so I'll hold off. Is that it's really been, a middle finger. A Tulsi Gabbard is a middle finger to the intelligence community. You guys all signed those letters. 8 of you signed the laptop letter. 800 of you signed that letter, endorsing Harris. Well, look at what I'm going to do, to you. And it was more messaging. I don't think he thinks she's going to get approved. I think there was, method behind his, extreme madness. I think we saw the same thing with with Matt Gaetz. There was no way he was going to become attorney general. I think anyone with the least amount of political background and understanding in the US understood that there was no way. But again, that was a big middle finger to all of the prosecutors that had gone after Trump. And I think that was just his way of getting attention, ranting and the like. What I would liken it to, though, is that instead of state capture, what it's more akin to is when you get some of these people, if they do get through, especially as John pointed out, in terms of, bypassing typical FBI checks. It's like, back in John's early days of being an intel officer, it's like he left that night and left his drawers unlocked, file cabinets open, the doors open, the windows open, with classified information all around, and went home. I think it's more the damage that can be done by having people that don't understand the importance of what they're dealing with, that can create some of the same effects of state capture that are going to make leaks, spying, et cetera, potentially more dangerous. And let me punt back to John on that, because he's lived that world. I have not, but he can kind of explain, and I think if there's one important point here, it's really on how does intel, how does classified information, how does all that get protected? Because John and I, just as authors that write together, we run into that all of the time, where we have to make sure that I'm not asking the wrong kind of question of John that encroaches upon his past classified access, to information. John?
Yeah, it really comes down to, I mean, one, just the person in charge understanding how the intelligence community works, but more importantly, the handling of intelligence. And we talk about this a lot. This notion of, sources and methods, not necessarily information. The information is important too, but if you burn a source and method, you lose access to that particular piece of information or that line of thought. And there's a reason why we have multiple layers of classification. We have caveats within those layers of classification, and we have extensive training for people who handle those pieces of information, and that they're not stored together, they're stored separately. Isolation, restricting people from seeing things. There's this thing called need to know, and that exists as well. And yes, we have soldiers that are 18 years old with top secret security clearances, and we have soldiers in their 60s, general officers with top secret security clearances. And we have the same level across all the agencies: DIA, NSA, CIA. It's the same. We all operate off of the same standard. Sources and methods are important in protecting the information. And I think there is concern when you put people with access to that information who haven't been properly vetted. How are they going to protect that information? Because as you and I well know, we can have a group of people go into a room to receive a briefing, and when they come out, they want to talk to the media about what they just heard. I mean, come on. I mean, and these are our elected officials that do that often. Behind closed doors meetings are for that reason. They're not to come out and share the information immediately with the press. And I think there's some concern, and rightfully so, about who you put into that position. She's not the right person. The right person is someone who's worked at that level. And I'll give you two examples. Karen Gibson, right now, is the current Sergeant of Arms in the U.S. Senate. Karen Gibson is a retired 3-star general officer whose last position was partner engagement within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, someone who understands intelligence and how it works across the community, a former J2 for U.S. CENTCOM. The other person I would give you an example of is Mary Legier, retired 3-star general officer who retired as the Army G2 and commanded the U.S. Intelligence and Security Command. Somebody who understands the intelligence community, somebody that knows how to leverage it and protect the information and have the right people doing the right jobs. Those are the type of people that the Trump administration needs to be looking to, not political appointees to sit in a desk and have to learn their job and potentially, because they don't understand their job, compromise intelligence.
Yeah,
So
I'd agree. Yeah. Yeah, no, I'd agree. I think maybe a better way for me to characterize it is, I think the potential here is not so much stage capture, but recklessness, and where recklessness can lead you. And I think that's the biggest risk that we're facing with the approach that Trump is taking. And one other reason in terms of why I don't think that people should be that concerned about state capture is there is nothing in Trump's history as a businessman, as the previous president, and even during his campaign, this man churns talent, and people come and go quickly. So it's awfully hard to capture a state if he's cycling through people like he does. Even someone as big as Elon Musk. Remember, there are almost 800 billionaires in the US. There's plenty of money to go around, even though technically Elon Musk is the richest guy. Doesn't mean there are a lot of not other rich guys. But he's a guy that's going to, at some point, come to loggerheads with Trump over China, because you've got China hawks and John Ratcliffe, who's the CIA director, another China hawk, Mike Waltz, the representative, is going to be the national security advisor. Marco Rubio, who's going to be the Secretary of State. All of those are China hawks, but you've got Elon Musk, he's got 23% of Tesla's profits are tied up inside of China. So that's a fight yet to come. And so, I'll be surprised if these same set of people are standing around Trump a year out. Now they may be, time will tell. But my bigger fear really here is not state capture, but really comes down to whether or not the recklessness of Trump, which he's demonstrated repeatedly throughout the past, doesn't create just a severe national security issues and crises to come.
So rather than the rather sort of crude impression of, Russia or Putin pulling the strings, rather it's much more likely we'll see the marginalization of professional talent within intelligence services, and we'll see things like dysfunction and paralysis. Is that really what we're sort of set to experience?
Yeah, I would argue yes. And for this reason, look, it's clear that the Biden administration, as well as, different state prosecutors, they were willing to go to any length possible to try to get Trump in court over XYZ charge. I guarantee you, with the full weight of the U.S. intelligence services, the access that Biden had, what the Justice Department could do, if they could have tied any kind of puppeteering, if you will, by Putin of Trump, he would have been charged with that. You've not seen that yet. And so from my standpoint, again, I don't mean that as a defense of Trump, not worried about defending him as a man. But what I'm trying to suggest is there's an awful lot of hysteria about that, but there's not any proof. Nobody can show that. Even the Steele dossier, the thing that came the closest, was proven to be basically a Russian plant. And yet it became circular that, oh, this must be true, but it's the Russians saying it. But oh, wait a minute, aren't the Russians the one who are really, really good at disinformation? And I'd make one last point here before flipping to John for the last word. John and I have written about this many times. We think there's a fundamental misunderstanding in the US that Putin is out to pick a side. That's not the Russian modus operandi. They want to create discord. They want Americans divided, fighting each other, undermining each other, etc. So that regardless of who wins, no one is going to be in a position of power to confront Russian interests and military machinations around the world. And I think we lose sight of that because we politicize Russia, both sides. You've seen the Democrats politicize it during the election. You've seen Trump minimize Russia's disinformation and interference in U.S. elections. So really, Russia, classic example of how Russia is playing both sides. They're getting the discord that they wanted, and I think we just got to be careful about that. John?
No, I agree exactly with Mark's last point. It's divisiveness. It's splitting the country.
Dividing, yeah,
they are. They're very good at it. And what it requires, and I think we've spoken about this before, it requires a certain level of critical thinking, particularly within the administration. Okay, when I say administration, Trump administration, but let me also include all facets of governance. To sit back and look and to critically examine what's being portrayed and not to act on information that they're receiving through social media or through unvetted sources. There's already discussion within political parties about who's going to support Trump, who's not going to support Trump. The reemergence of a deep state that's not going to allow his policies to work within certain branches of governance. And that's exactly what we don't need. What we don't need is 4 years of that, because the country will never progress forward. We will never be able to accomplish what we need to accomplish in the national security arena if we're constantly fighting ourselves because we don't want one side or the other to get any type of, if you will, acknowledgement or recognition of either something positive or something negative. But that's where we are, I believe, within governance today, within the United States today. We have this bitter divide and this inability to reach across the lines. Now, there is an extreme right and there is an extreme left, and I do believe that there is still a middle that wants to do right, that wants what's best for our country and what wants what's best for those countries that we support. And I would like to think that that this concept of defend democracy isn't just the United States, but rather the concept of democracy throughout the world, and that we get behind Ukraine and that we get behind Israel, as the Trump administration has vocally said many times that they will get behind Israel. But it's not just Israel, it's so much more than Israel. And if we're going to defend democracy, let's defend all of democracy, not just what's politically acceptable.
Hey, Jonathan, if I could add a point real quick, because I think it affects all of us as journalists, something that we need to be doing, in the scheme of things, how to solve all of these things, how to get Ukraine back to the forefront of American thinking and like. I think we have to rethink the outlets that we're going to. One of the things is very clear in the postmortem that's been done since the US election is that Trump was onto something. Whether you like him or hate him, he figured something out. He realized that a lot of Americans have tuned out legacy media. They're not reading John and me in the New York Post or The Hill. Many are, but not a certain segment of the population. They're going on shows like Joe Rogan and the like. And we've got to figure out how, as journalists, to get into that discussion so that we can bring the issues of why Ukraine is so important, why confronting Russia is so important, why China loses is a problem, because we're missing a huge segment. And I think if there's anything that will be the biggest takeaway from Democrats in this election is they didn't learn how to talk to those group of people. It's not a question of they weren't able to make persuasive arguments to them. They weren't even getting to them. And they were yielding that, to Trump, who was willing to go to the Joe Rogans. And look, as a person of the 60s, I was scratching my head even at the Republican convention. What the heck is, Hulk Hogan doing at the Republican National Convention? But there was method to that madness. They were speaking to someone different than whom I'm used to speaking to. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us as we sit back, as we exchange, private messages to each other, we have to expand the platforms and the reach and the audiences that we're aiming at to bring up all of these kind of valuable discussions. Because if we just keep going after the chorus, we're not going to change that dynamic. And unfortunately, I think U.S. national security is going to suffer as a consequence. Thanks for letting me get that in there.
Absolutely. Well, John and Mark, it's been a tremendous pleasure speaking again. I know the audience find tremendous value in having these non-partisan conversations, and it's incredibly important, as you say, to keep doing this and indeed intensify it as we head into the new administration in January. So I look forward to the next time in bringing you back, and I strongly encourage people to follow your strong journalistic output on topics such as the Middle East and, of course, Ukraine.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, Jonathan, thanks for having us back on. We appreciate the opportunity.